Soviet dissidents were persons who disagreed with certain features in the embodiment of Soviet ideology and who were willing to speak out against them. As concerns the communist world, it is commonly recognized that the dissident sits apart from the regime. The dissidents were small groups of marginalized intellectuals whose modest challenges to the Soviet regime met protection and encouragement from correspondents.Leonid. Brezhnev succeeded in preventing many professionals from becoming a vocal opposition, and the open Soviet dissidents became more an international embarrassment than an internal danger. Soviet dissidents who criticized the state faced possible legal sanctions under Articles 70, 72, 142, 190.1, and 227 of the Soviet Criminal Code and faced the choice of exile, the mental hospital, or the labor camp. Anti-Soviet political behavior, in particular, being outspoken in opposition to the authorities demonstrating for reform. Writing books were defined in some persons as being simultaneously a criminal act, a symptom, and a diagnosis. Over time, the dissident movement created vivid awareness of Soviet communist tyranny. Due to a half-century of Soviet repression, Soviet scientists who had managed to emigrate greatly enriched American science. Political opposition in the USSR was barely visible and, with rare exceptions, of little consequence. The 1950s–1960s. In the 1950s, Soviet dissidents started leaking criticism to the West by sending documents and statements to foreign diplomatic missions in Moscow. In the 1960s, Soviet dissidents frequently declared that the rights the government of the Soviet Union denied them were universal rights, possessed by everyone regardless of race, religion and nationality. In August 1969, for instance, the initiating group for defensive civil rights in the USSR appealed to the United Nations Committee on Human Rights to defend the human rights being trampled on by Soviet authorities in a number of trials. The 1970s. Our history shows that most of the people can be fooled for a very long time. But now all this idiocy is coming into clear contradiction with the fact that we have some level of openness. The heyday of the dissenters as a presence in the Western public life was the 1970s. The Helsinki Accords inspired dissidents in the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Poland to openly protest human rights failures by their own governments. The Soviet dissidents demanded that the Soviet authorities implement their own commitments proceeding from the Helsinki Agreement with the same zeal, and in the same way as formerly the outspoken legalists expected the Soviet authorities to adhere strictly to the letter of the Constitution. Dissident Russian and East European intellectuals who urged compliance with the Helsinki Accords have been subjected to official repression. According to Soviet dissident Leonid Plyush, Moscow has taken advantage of the Helsinki Security Pact to improve its economy while increasing the suppression of political dissenters. 50 members of Soviet Helsinki groups were imprisoned. ASES of political prisoners and prisoners of conscience in the Soviet Union were divulged by Amnesty International in 1975 and by the Committee for the Defense of Soviet Political Prisoners in 1975 and 1976. U.S. President Jimmy Carter, in his inaugural address on the 20th of January 1977, announced that human rights would be central to foreign policy during his administration. In February, Carter sent Andrei Dmitrievich Sakharov a letter expressing his support for the latter's stance on human rights. In the wake of Carter's letter to Sakharov, the USSR cautioned against attempts to interfere in its affairs under a thought-up pretext of defending human rights. Because of Carter's open show of support for Soviet dissidents, the KGB was able to link dissent with American imperialism. journalism through suggesting that such protest is a cover for American espionage in the Soviet Union. The KGB head Yuri Andropov determined the need has thus emerged to terminate the actions of all of fellow Helsinki monitor Ginsburg and others once and for all, on the basis of existing law. Quote, according to Dmitry Volkogonov and Harold Schuckman, it was Andropov who approved the numerous trials of human rights activists such as Andrei Amalrik, Vladimir Bukowski, Vyacheslav Chornovil, Zavir Gamsakhurdia, Alexander Ginsburg, Natalia Gorbanevskaya, Pyotr Grigorenko, Anatoly Shperansky, and others. According to Soviet dissident Yuri Glazev, Andropov was a paradigmatic Homo Sovieticus and personally conducted disinformation campaigns against his main opponents and dissidents Andrei Sakharov and Alexander Solzhenitsyn. If we accept human rights violations as just the way of doing things, then we are all guilty. Voluntary and involuntary emigration allowed the authorities to rid themselves of many political active intellectuals, including writers Valentin Turchin, Georgy Vladimov, Vladimir Voinovich, Lev Kopelev, Vladimir Maximov, Norm Kortshaven, Vasily Aksionov and others. A chronicle of current events covered 424 political trials, in which 753 people were convicted, and no one of the accused was acquitted. In addition, 164 people were declared insane and sent to compulsory treatment in a psychiatric hospital. According to Soviet dissidents and Western critics, the KGB had routinely sent dissenters to psychiatrists for diagnosing to avoid embarrassing public trials and to discredit dissidents as the product of ill minds, on the grounds that political dissenters in the Soviet Union were psychotic and deluded. They were locked away in psychiatric hospitals and treated with neuroleptics. Confinement of political dissenters in psychiatric institutions had become a common practice. The technique could be called the medicalization of dissidents, a psychiatric terror, the now familiar form of repression applied in the Soviet Union to Leonid Plyush, Pyotr Grigorenko, and many others. Finally, many persons at the time tended to believe that dissidents were abnormal people whose commitment to mental hospitals was quite justified. In the opinion of the Moscow-Helsinki group chairwoman Lyudmila Alexeyeva, the attribution of a mental illness to a prominent figure who came out with a political declaration or action is the most significant factor in the assessment of psychiatry during the 1960 to 1980s. At the time, Soviet dissident Vladimir Bukowski wrote A New Mental Illness in the USSR. The opposition published in French, German, Italian, Spanish and a manual on psychiatry for dissidents published in Russian, English, French, Italian, German, Danish. Repression of the Helsinki watch groups in 1977 to 1979 and again in 1980 to 1982. The KGB reacted to the Helsinki watch groups in Moscow, Kiev, Vilnius, Tbilisi, and Yerevan by launching large-scale arrests and sentencing its members to in-prison, labor camp, internal exile and psychiatric imprisonment. For the members of the Moscow-Helsinki Group, 1978 saw its members Yuri Orlov, Vladimir Slepak and Anatoly Shperansky sentenced to lengthy labor camp terms and internal exile for anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda and treason. Another wave of arrests followed in the early 1980s. Malva Landa, Viktor Nekipolov, Leonid Ternovsky, Felix Serebrov, Tatiana Osipova, Anatoly Marchenko, and Ivan Kovalev. Soviet authorities offered some activists the opportunity to emigrate. Lyudmila Alexeyeva emigrated in 1977. The Moscow-Helsinki group founding members Mikhail Bernstam, Alexander Korchak, Vitaly Rubin also emigrated, and Pyotr Grigorenko was stripped of his Soviet citizenship while seeking medical treatment abroad. The Ukrainian Helsinki group suffered severe repressions throughout 1977 to 1982, with at times multiple labor camp sentences handed out to Mykola Rudenko, Oleksiy Tyky, Miroslav Marinovich, Mykola Matuzevich, Levko Lukyanenko, Olej Zberdnik, Mykola Horbal, Zinovy Krashevsky, Vitaly Kalinichenko, Vyacheslav Chornovil, Olha Hayko, Vasil Stas, Oksana Meshko, Ivan Sokolsky, Ivan Kandyba, Petro Rozumny, Vasil Striltsev, Jaroslav Lizhev, Vasil Sechko, Yuri Litvin, Petro Sechko. By 1983 the Ukrainian Helsinki group had 37 members, of whom 22 were in prison camps, 5 were in exile, 6 emigrated to the West, 3 were released and were living in Ukraine, 1 committed suicide. The Lithuanian Helsinki group saw its members subjected to 2 waves of imprisonment for anti-Soviet activities and organization of religious processions. Viktoras Petkus was sentenced in 1978, others followed in 1981. Algirdas Statkovicius, Vytautas Skewardis, Mesislavas Jurevicius, and Vytautas Vaičiūnas. Currents of dissidents. Civil and human rights movement starting in the 1960s, the early years of the Brezhnev stagnation. Dissidents in the Soviet Union increasingly turned their attention towards civil and eventually human rights concerns. The fight for civil and human rights focused on issues of freedom of expression, freedom of conscience, freedom to emigrate, punitive psychiatry, and the plight of political prisoners. It was characterized by a new openness of dissent, a concern for legality, the rejection of any underground and violent struggle. Throughout the 1960s-1980s, those active in the civil and human rights movement engaged in a variety of activities. The documentation of political repression and rights violations in samizdat, individual and collective protest letters and petitions, unsanctioned demonstrations, mutual aid for prisoners of conscience, and, most prominently, civic watch groups appealing to the international community. Repercussions for these activities ranged from dismissal from work and studies to many years of imprisonment in labor camps and being subjected to punitive psychiatry. Dissidents active in the movement in the 1960s introduced a legalist approach of avoiding moral and political commentary in favor of close attention to legal and procedural issues. Following several landmark political trials, coverage of arrests and trials in samizdat became more common. This activity eventually led to the founding of the Chronicle of Current Events in April 1968. The unofficial newsletter reported violations of civil rights and judicial procedure by the Soviet government and responses to those violations by citizens across the USSR. During the late 1960s and throughout the 1970s, the rights-based strategy of dissent incorporated human rights ideas and rhetoric. The movement included figures such as Valery Chalizay, Yuri Orlov, and Lyudmila Alexeyeva. Special groups were founded such as the Initiative Group for the Defense of Human Rights in the USSR and the Committee on Human Rights in the USSR. The signing of the Helsinki Accords containing human rights clauses provided rights campaigners with a new hope to use international instruments. This led to the creation of dedicated Helsinki watch groups in Moscow, Kiev, Vilnius, Tbilisi, and Yerevan. The civil and human rights initiatives played a significant role in providing a common language for Soviet dissidents with varying concerns, and became a common cause for social groups in the dissident milieu, ranging from activists in the youth subculture to academics such as Andrei Sakharov. Due to the contacts with Western journalists as well as the political focus during détente, those active in the human rights movement were among those most visible in the West. Movements of deported nations. Several national or ethnic groups who had been deported under Stalin formed movements to return to their homelands. In particular, the Crimean Tatars aimed to return to Crimea, the Meskhetian Turks to South Georgia, and ethnic Germans aimed to resettle along the Volga River near Saratov. The Crimean Tatar movement takes a prominent place among the movement of deported nations. The Tatars had been refused the right to return to the Crimea, even though the laws justifying the deportation had been overturned. The first collective letter calling for the restoration dates to 1957. In the early 1960s, the Crimean Tatars had begun to establish initiative groups in the places where they had been forcibly resettled. Led by Mustafa Zhemilev, they founded their own democratic and decentralized organization, considered unique in the history of independent movements in the Soviet Union. Emigration movements. The emigration movements in the Soviet Union included the movement of Soviet Jews to emigrate to Israel and of the Volga Germans to emigrate to West Germany. Soviet Jews were routinely denied permission to emigrate by the authorities of the former Soviet Union and other countries of the Eastern Bloc. A movement for the right to emigrate formed in the 1960s, which also gave rise to a revival of interest in Jewish culture. The Refusnik cause gathered considerable attention in the West. Citizens of German origin who lived in the Baltic states prior to their annexation in 1940 and descendants of the 18th-century Volga German settlers also formed a movement to leave the Soviet Union. In 1972, the West German government entered an agreement with the Soviet authorities which permitted between 6,000 and 8,000 people to emigrate to West Germany every year for the rest of the decade. As a result, almost 70,000 ethnic Germans had left the Soviet Union by the mid-1980s. Similarly, Armenians achieved a small emigration. By the mid-1980s, over 15,000 Armenians had emigrated. Religious movements. The religious movements in the USSR included Russian Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant movements. They focused on the freedom to practice the faith and resistance to interference by the state in their internal affairs. The Russian Orthodox movement remained relatively small. The Catholic movement in Lithuania was part of the larger Lithuanian national movement. Protestant groups which opposed the anti-religious state directives included the Baptists, the Seventh-day Adventists, and the Pentecostals. Similar to the Jewish and German dissident movements, many in the independent Pentecostal movement pursued emigration. National movements. The national movements included the Russian national dissidents as well as dissident movements from Ukraine, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Georgia, and Armenia. Among the nations that lived in their own territories with the status of republics within the Soviet Union, the first movement to emerge in the 1960s was the Ukrainian movement. Its aspiration was to resist the Russification of Ukraine and to insist on equal rights and democratization for the republic. In Lithuania, the national movement of the 1970s was closely linked to the Catholic movement. Literary and cultural. Several landmark examples of dissenting writers played a significant role for the wider dissident movement. These include the persecutions of Osip Mandelstam, Boris Pasternak, Mikhail Bulgakov, and Joseph Brodsky, as well as the publication of the Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. In literary world, there were dozens of literati who participated in dissident movement, including Vasily Aksionov, Arkady Belenkov, Leonid Borodin, Joseph Brodsky, Georgy Vladimov, Vladimir Voinovich, Alexander Galik, Venedikt Yerofeyev, Alexander Zinoviev, Lev Kopelev, Norm Kortshaven, Vladimir Maximov, Viktor Nekrasov, Andrei Sinyavsky, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and Varlam Shalamov. In the early Soviet Union, non-conforming academics were exiled via so-called philosophers' ships. Later, figures such as cultural theorist Grigory Pomerantz were among active dissidents. Other intersections of cultural and literary nonconformism with dissidents include the wide field of Soviet nonconformist art, such as the painters of the underground Liano-Zervo group and artists active in the second culture. Other groups included the socialists, the movements for socio-economic rights, as well as women's, environmental, and peace movements, dissidents and the Cold War. Responding to the issue of refuseniks in the Soviet Union, the United States Congress passed the Jackson-Vanik Amendment in 1974. The provision in United States federal law intended to affect U.S. trade relations with countries of the communist bloc that restrict freedom of emigration and other human rights. The 8 member countries of the Warsaw Pact signed the Helsinki Final Act in August 1975. The third basket of the act included extensive human rights clauses. When Jimmy Carter entered office in 1976, he broadened his advisory circle to include critics of U.S.-Soviet détente. He voiced support for the Czech dissident movement known as Charter 77, and publicly expressed concern about the Soviet treatment of dissidents Alexander Ginsburg and Andrei Sakharov. In 1977, Carter received prominent dissident Vladimir Bukowski in the White House, asserting that he did not intend to be timid in his support of human rights. In 1979, the U.S. Helsinki Watch Committee was established, funded by the Ford Foundation, founded after the example of the Moscow-Helsinki Group and similar watch groups in the Soviet bloc. It also aimed to monitor compliance with the human rights provisions of the Helsinki Accords and to provide moral support for those struggling for that objective inside the Soviet bloc. It acted as a conduit for information on repression in the Soviet Union, and lobbied policymakers in the United States to continue to press the issue with Soviet leaders. U.S. President Ronald Reagan attributed to the view that the brutal treatment of Soviet dissidents was due to bureaucratic inertia. On the 14th of November 1988, he held a meeting with Andrei Sakharov at the White House and said that Soviet human rights abuses are impeding progress and would continue to do so until the problem is completely eliminated. Whether talking to about 100 dissidents in a broadcast to the Soviet people or at the U.S. Embassy, Reagan's agenda was one of freedom to travel, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. There is an opinion that Star Wars program, which was launched in the U.S. under Ronald Reagan, was a major factor in the chain of events that led to the first defeat of the USSR in the Cold War and later to the collapse of the communist regime in the country. Dissidents about their dissent. Andrei Sakharov said, "Everyone wants to have a job, be married, have children, be happy. But dissidents must be prepared to see their lives destroyed and those dear to them hurt. When I look at my situation and my family's situation and that of my country, I realize that things are getting steadily worse." Fellow dissident and one of the founders of the Moscow-Helsinki group Lyudmila Alexeyeva wrote, "What would happen if citizens acted on the assumption that they have rights? If one person did it, he would become a martyr. However, if two people did it, they would be labeled an enemy organization. If thousands of people did it, the state would have to become less oppressive. According to Soviet dissident Viktor Davidov, totalitarian system has no mechanisms that could change the behavior of the ruling group from within. Any attempts to change this are immediately suppressed through repression. Dissidents appealed to international human rights organizations, foreign governments, and there was a result. The same should be used now as well, in the situation where the mass manipulation through the media brought the country to the point where people do not realize what happens in the country. When people do not understand what is going on in the world, one can only rely on the fact that those who know and understand will be able to find common language with people abroad and thus to change the situation. Audio-visual material. Radio Liberty. Natalia Boldianskaya. Episode 1. Dissidents. Who are they? Voice of America. Parallels. Events. People. Natalia Boldianskaya. Episode 2. Dissidents. What did they want? Voice of America. Parallels. Events. People. DOZHD. Radio France Internationale. Radio Liberty. Vladimir V. Kara Murza. They chose freedom. The story of Soviet dissidents. Institute of Modern Russia. The history of the MHG and human rights movement in Russian. 53 minutes on YouTube. Vaclav Havel and Soviet dissidents. 8 minutes on YouTube. Nonconformism and dissent in the Soviet bloc. Guiding legacy, a passing memory. Harriman Institute. Columbia University. The 1st of April 2011. Retrieved the 27th of February 2016. Day 1. Panel 1. 84 minutes on YouTube. Day 2. Panel 1. 134 minutes on YouTube. Day 2. Panel 2. 119 minutes on YouTube. Day 2. Panel 3. 112 minutes on YouTube. Day 3. Panel 1. 83 minutes on YouTube. Day 3. Panel 2. 106 minutes on YouTube. Day 3. Panel 3. 107 minutes on YouTube.